Okay, good morning, everybody. Well, let me just give you a little preview of the day while I'm up here, and then, hi, Varun, good morning, and say a few words about the panel. So the purpose of the panel is actually to kick off the conversations that you're going to have in your breakout groups, which will be right after this. And so we actually want to hear from you, but we want to just set the stage for the conversation this morning through the panel. And you'll have discussion leaders in the rooms just next door, A and B, and your name tags say which group you're in. So with that, I want to get started with our panelists. The Next Gen project, as you've already heard this morning, actually discusses a number of issues at different meetings. But we chose the issue of energy because perhaps there's no issue that requires a Schumpeterian creative destruction more than the question of energy. It utterly pervades almost every aspect of American policy, whether it be the economy, the environment, national security, foreign policy, pretty much everything. And so we really want to be involved in the process of creative thinking with you today on these issues. So to begin, we have several very distinguished young scholars here, starting with Josh Busby, who's an assistant professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. Prior to coming to UT, Dr. Busby was a research fellow at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. He got his PhD from Georgetown University, and he's currently working on a book manuscript entitled States of Grace, Moral Movements in Foreign Policy. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you need to update your bio. Well, so he's already written a book on this subject. And he explores in his research the politics of climate change, developing country debt relief, HIV/AIDS, and the International Criminal Court. So with that, Dr. Busby is going to talk about energy, the environment. They're going to give about 8 to 10 minutes of comments, and then we'll take some questions, and then we'll move into our breakout groups. So please, Josh.
All right. Well, it's great to be here with all of you and to have the opportunity to participate in another Next Generation gathering. I remember distinctly the first of these that was held right here in Dallas back on this date 5 years ago in 2006. We then went on to do meetings in San Diego, Denver, Chicago, and DC. And I participated as part of the leadership team on those events and know this is a great opportunity to meet people from different fields and perspectives and to talk about issues in ways that get beyond the partisan rancor that we often see in the public arena. And I have the book of those previous assemblies, and maybe I'll draw upon it in the subsequent discussion. I'm tasked with addressing the issue of the environment and energy, and I come at this as a political scientist with a particular interest in global policy in the international arena. Some years ago, I went to a conference in Sweden on energy security, and it was almost like two separate gatherings. The oil and gas people who were worried about security of supply were over here, and then the environmental people who were worried about global warming were on the other side. And though it was one conference, you had breakout sessions, and the oil and gas people went to the workshops talking about new pipelines, Russia's behavior in its near abroad, and so on. And the climate people went to their corner to talk about renewables, low carbon economy, and the impacts of global warming that demand a clean energy transition. So you essentially had two conferences, and the people who should have been talking to each other were talking past each other or weren't talking to each other at all. And you see this kind of separation in policy discussion happen here in the U.S., but the argument takes on an even less tempered tone. On one side, you hear arguments such as, we must allow the Keystone XL pipeline to be built to bring oil from Canada's tar sands to Texas because we need the jobs. And on the other, you hear, we cannot allow the Keystone pipeline to be built or else it is game over for climate change, or the leaks will contaminate Nebraska's water supply. Now, some say we must drill more off of our shores domestically everywhere, including California, Florida, Virginia, because we need the oil and we need the jobs. And others say we cannot drill in new offshore sites because of the risks of more deep water horizons and ecologically sensitive sites. And in the natural gas field, we hear advocates that support the expansion of fracking make the case that that process should remain unregulated, that natural gas is an abundant source of domestic clean energy. And then others look to the experience of expansion of this sector and want to put a halt to it to prevent contamination of drinking water and potentially other problems. Now, listening to the public debate, you might not know it, but there can be more nuanced positions than all or nothing. Though when the choice comes down to supporting a pipeline or not, there are some tough trade-offs that often have to be made. And in other cases, and maybe if in a different world, we might well say, well, we'll support reopening of the Gulf of Mexico to offshore drilling, but we still think Florida, California, parts of Alaska may be too environmentally sensitive to open up. Or we'll consider more drilling if you'll support measures to bring about a long-run transition to a low-carbon economy. Or in other cases, we might say, yes, we support fracking technology and generally think natural gas is a cleaner, cost-effective domestic energy alternative, but we need some rules to protect the public from unscrupulous operators. Now, unfortunately, such a balanced approach appears to be beyond us at this moment, no more so than the case of global warming, which has been elevated to an issue of symbolic partisan identification. One party owns this issue, and the other has increasingly made its contestation of the science a signifier of what it means to be a member. Now, the current state of affairs is an absolute disaster for those of us who are convinced that the issue is a real problem. In a political system such as ours, no single party has enough power to pass its agenda without support from the other. And it goes beyond global warming. One party is increasingly opposed to environmental regulation of almost any kind. It used to be different. I mean, conservative and conservation have the same root. The EPA was created under President Nixon. Now, on the issue of global warming, it's one thing in difficult economic times like we're now living in for a leader to say, as John Huntsman has said, yes, it's a real problem, but I don't think we can afford solution X at the moment. I respect that, even though I respectfully disagree. And it's quite another for people to entertain attitudes so at odds with what the scientific community is saying. So let me substantiate this a bit. The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences published a review of almost 1,400 climate researchers in 2010, finding that 97 to 98% of those publishing in the field believe humans are causing global warming. And a survey in 2009 found similar percentages. And our own state climatologist, John Nielsen Gammon, parsed other studies and concluded among Earth scientists that 90 to 97%, depending on the study, believe that global surface temperatures have increased over the past century or two. And 82 or 84% believe that human activity is significantly contributing to the warming, and 85% think that the warming is at least moderately dangerous. Now, yesterday, the final results of a study by a Berkeley research team were released. This team included Richard Muller, a physicist known to be skeptical of the science of global warming, particularly with respect to the degree to which the Earth's warming is correlated with greenhouse gas emissions. He's a MacArthur Genius Award winner, and his team includes a Nobel Prize-winning scientist. They analyzed more than 1 billion temperature records dating back to the 1800s from 15 sources, and they found that the average global land temperature has risen by around 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit since the mid-50s. And here's what he said about his findings. He said, "My hope is that this will win over those people who are properly skeptical." Now, people who think this is a hoax perpetrated by scientists who merely want to get research grants fundamentally don't understand the scientific process. Here's the thing about science. If you fake it, someone will call you out. Those thousands of scientists do not all simultaneously have an incentive to make things up because in time, falsifying data and conclusions are the surest way to lose your credibility and your livelihood. Now, how have we gotten to this place? Part of the problem surely lies with activists who, with their talk of green jobs, made it sound like this was an easy problem that wouldn't involve difficult choices. Walter Russell Mead describes this agenda as feeding the masses on unicorn ribs. Now, I tend to think in time there will ultimately be many good jobs in this sector, but we need to be careful about overselling this as the solution to the economic crisis. It's not an easy problem to solve. There are hundreds of millions of people on the planet who lack access to basic electrification, so extending access will be hugely important for them. And our energy system is largely reliant on fossil fuels. Moving away from that can't happen overnight, but will require transformation in how we heat and light our homes and how we move ourselves around. Making the transition may be costly, but it is also necessary. Fortunately, we have a lot of room for improvement because we just don't use existing energy sources all that efficiently. So in conclusion, the current approach is simply unsustainable. In Texas, we're experiencing the hottest year on record in the history of any state in the nation since records began. This is the worst drought in decades, potentially ever. Most of the Lost Pines of Bastrop burned. Lubbock just experienced an 8,000-foot dust storm. In the Austin area, Lakes Travis and Buchanan are now 38% full. And at the state level, we've just sustained $5.2 billion in damages to the agricultural sector. Now, I know this drought is in part the product of an especially strong La Nina effect, which the state climatologist last week said could last until 2020. No, but we also have strong reasons to believe that this kind of weather will be the new normal with global warming. It's only ultimately going to become necessary to do something to ward off the worst consequences of global warming and prepare for those that are already inevitable. So going forward, I hope that we can have a conversation about the different things that we value, how we can best pursue economic growth, jobs, reliable, affordable, and sustainable sources of energy. There will be some difficult trade-offs and a need for priority setting, but maybe an honest dialogue about these multiple ambitions can yield a different policy environment than the one we've got. It's that kind of aspiration that makes me so enthusiastic about gatherings like this one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, now we're going to move to Professor William Inboden, also a assistant professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT. Previously, Will served as the Senior Director for Strategic Planning on the National Security Council at the White House, where he worked on a range of foreign policy issues, including the national security strategy, democracy and governance, contingency planning, counter-radicalization, and multilateral institutions and initiatives. Will Inboden was also the Senior Vice President of the London-based Legatum Institute and a contributing editor to Foreign Policy magazine. He is currently writing the book, just kidding. He's the author of Religion and Containment, Foreign Policy, 1945 to 1960, Religion and American Foreign Policy, 1945 to 1960, The Soul of Containment. Inboden received his PhD and MA degrees in history from Yale University and attended a very fine institution in California, Stanford University, for his bachelor's. Will is going to speak on energy and national security. Will, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Celeste, and thank you, Josh. A word you probably didn't hear in my little mini bio that Celeste just read there is energy. And I come at this from a background of, I graduated from college in 1994 and then spent the next good part of the next 18 years working on foreign policy issues in Washington and in Congress and in State Department and NSC. And what I pretty quickly learned and continued to be exposed to from any number of different positions I held is that even if you didn't go into those jobs thinking you'd work on energy policy or with an interest in energy policy, it's really inescapable for anyone who wants to do just about anything related to foreign policy and national security policy. So while I still won't give any pretense of being an expert on energy policy and energy issues per se, I think for those of you here who may not have that particular interest in energy policy but are concerned with our nation's foreign policy and national security interests, like I said, we've got to become familiar with energy issues. So during my 8 minutes here, I want to suggest 8 different ways that energy issues relate to national security policy. These are going to be breezy, cursory. Think of them as just catalysts for the discussions we'll be having throughout the day, so we can explore them perhaps in the discussion sessions following this. And I'll say that each of these 8 ways has its own distinctives, but in some ways it's kind of overlap with a number of the others. So these are a web of different ways that energy issues relate to national security policy. First is energy is a source of power. Now, of course, that sounds like a tautology, but I'm not talking about power in terms of making things go and expending calories, but power as a nation's ability to exert influence and advance its will in the international scene. That's kind of a paraphrase of how the Harvard scholar Joe Nye defines power. And if we look at the most powerful countries in the world in terms of economic resources and military capacity, starting with the United States, Oftentimes we see that significant energy reserves and our energy capacity is a really inseparable, indispensable component of national power. And it also helps explain the either the rise to power or the resurgence of nations that otherwise probably wouldn't be that powerful. Qatar, for example, tiny geography, certainly not much else to commend it, but has quickly become a regional power in the Middle East precisely because of its phenomenal natural gas reserves as well as some petroleum reserves. Venezuela, again, another one. You can't understand Venezuela and sort of Chavez's regional ambitions and influence aside from their petroleum reserves. Or Russia's resurgence. 15 years ago, the Atlantic ran this now notorious cover story, Russia is finished. Russia was pretty much a failed state at the time. It was going to become the largest failed state in world history. And yet now Russia has, by a lot of metrics, returned to the ranks of great powers. Why? Because of their energy reserves and the boom in commodity prices. Even Singapore, which may not have a lot in the way of fossil fuel reserves itself, because of its tremendous refining capacity, this has been really key to Singapore's upsurge as a regional power in Asia. Second, energy as an alliance catalyst. Again, when nations like the United States are looking for who are going to be our partners and friends and the nations we want to have close ties with around the world, energy is often going to be a significant factor here. Again, there's no other way of understanding the U.S.-Saudi relationship than obviously their petroleum reserves, or for that matter, our relationship with lesser powers such as Kuwait. Third, energy as a coercive instrument, and this is in a non-violent sense, but still the way that a nation can use energy to exert its will coercively on other nations. Classic case would be the OPEC countries and their oil embargo following the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which completely rejiggered the international order. Other one more recently would be Russia's cutoff of natural gas supplies to Ukraine when it wanted to re-engineer Ukrainian domestic politics. Fourth, energy as a weapon in the literal sense, as a instrument of violent coercion. And this is, I'm thinking here particularly of when I was working on counterterrorism at the NSC, the scenario that preoccupied us day in and day out all the time was the nuclear terrorism or even a dirty radioactive bomb. One really interesting tidbit from this fantastic new book by Joby Warwick, The Triple Agent, about the 8 CIA officers killed by the Al-Qaeda terrorist in Afghanistan last year, is that in 2009, for a few weeks there, the U.S. was convinced, due to intelligence intercepts, that the Taliban actually had a radioactive device. And this, again, completely scrambled the system and would have been absolutely catastrophic. So while I'm generally optimistic on nuclear energy as one of the solutions to the energy issues facing the world, we need to be mindful there's some real significant downsides here, such as when the radioactive materials can be used as a weapon. Fifth, energy as a target. Again, this is almost the flip side of it. As you may recall, in 2006, Al-Qaeda launched a failed attack against the Abqaiq petroleum processing plant in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, where 8% of the world's petroleum reserves are processed every day. If they would have been successful, and they almost breached the second security perimeter, would have been absolutely catastrophic for the global economy. And when bin Laden was killed earlier this year, and we went through and gathered all the raw intelligence data from his house, we discovered that he had more plans in the foot for more attacks on petroleum refineries. So again, Al-Qaeda sees energy as a target, a key node in the global economic infrastructure. Six, energy as a stabilizer. Again, one of the sort of cardinal tenets of those who work on foreign policy is we want to preserve international stability, a stable international order, and only within that stability can progress occur, can Schumpeterian creative destruction actually occur without the whole world completely falling apart. And the reliability of safe and secure energy supplies is absolutely essential to a stable international order. Seventh, energy as a mischief proxy. If you could come up with a better term than this one, this is the best one I could come up with. But again, one of the things that has policy makers so wrapped around the axle over the North Korean nuclear program and the Iranian nuclear program is this game, I'll say that the Iranians and North Koreans are very good at saying, this is not for building nuclear weapons. This is what the North Koreans told us before they actually did show us for a nuclear weapon. This is just for our peaceful energy needs. This is why we need to be enriching uranium. This is why we need to be reprocessing plutonium. But as we now see that this was more of a proxy for some of their nuclear weapons mischief. But still, it's an important issue for relatively closed developing countries. How are they going to meet their peaceful energy needs? And then finally, the eighth one is energy as a great power aggravator. Again, as we look at the different areas, different regions where there are great power frictions and potentially new great power conflicts, very often it's going to be over energy issues, over access to energy supplies. It certainly seems to be what's going on with China's resource nationalism, some of their more assertive territorial claims in the South China Sea, some of the frictions that they're experiencing between with India, even what might be going on in the Arctic Circle with Russia and that great power Denmark, who actually has a lot of access to the Arctic Circle, and the United States and Canada. So if you want to understand great power relations in the 21st century, particularly neuralgic friction points and where conflicts might be occurring, energy often is going to be the aggravator there. So I will welcome any feedback and thoughts on those, and hopefully those help prompt some of our discussions later today. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Will. Thank you. Okay, now let me turn to Professor Varun Rai. He's an assistant professor of public affairs at the LBJ School as well. Varun earned his PhD in mechanical engineering from Stanford in 2008, specializing in energy systems and technologies. He also holds an MS from Stanford and a bachelor's degree from the Indian Institute of Technology. His principal research interests are in technological change, innovation and diffusion, economics of climate change, and integrated assessment models, and energy and development. His research has been published in Harvard International Review, Newsweek, Energy Policy, Economic and Political Weekly, and the IAEE Energy Forum. So with that, Varun, welcome. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Celeste. It's really a pleasure to be here. I have the dual pleasure of being on this distinguished panel, but also later in the day, I'll be on the other side of the table. I'm also one of the fellows, so I really look forward to the discussions there. Frank has asked me to raise a few questions that will spur some discussion in this sessions. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to give you any answers, as I try to do when I'm teaching a course or when I'm writing a paper. So these will all be very, very broad, difficult questions for which there are no answers. But that's why we are here, to try to discuss and figure out what we need to do as a group. It almost makes me wonder why Bill stopped at 8 questions. If he had added one more, that would be 9, and we would be at Herman Cain's 999 formula. But I'll just go with, I'll start by making 3 observations, and I'll raise 3 broad questions. The first observation I want to make is, well, really, if you look at the history of human society, going back to thousands of years, technological change really has been the main driver of economic growth, okay? You can always debate about the causality, whether it is economic growth that changes technology, or whether technological change drives economic growth. But most of us believe, and there's very, very strong evidence and almost unquestionable, that it is really technological change that drives a lot of economic growth. So that's very important. So let's focus down to the last 70 years. Last 70 years, and this is right before the Second World War, and since then, most of technological change, productivity has been done through organized R&D, both in the private sector as well as government spending on R&D and innovation. So national labs, large labs at big companies like Exxon or other wind companies, or any. So essentially, it's most of the innovation, technological change is happening, and the driver of that is organized R&D. Now, let's turn to what we have been doing here in the U.S. in terms of our R&D spending, how much we are spending, what we are providing to support this type of R&D and innovation. Our spending in the last 20 years has gone down by an order of magnitude, almost, give or take here and there. Let's look at China. Its spending has gone up by 1 order of magnitude. Okay, and I'll come back to this topic. Just remember what this shift has done. It has shifted the difference by 100 times, almost 100 times between U.S. and China. It doesn't mean that China is spending a lot more, which it is on R&D, but the order of magnitude. So it has huge implications for global policy, as we heard from Bill, but it also has huge implications for competitive advantage, and we all ought to be thinking about those issues. So those are my observations. Let me move to the questions. Well, if we know that innovation, technological change is the magic bullet, well, let's just go do it. Here's the thing. It's not as simple, right? As we heard from Josh, there are all sorts of issues. Two groups. One group wants to do something. The other group wants to do other things. So there are huge constraints. There are other important policy issues. Development that we'll hear, energy security, health, social security, Medicare, Medicaid, which we are all grappling with, and they're huge issues. So there are tremendous constraints on what we have and how to allocate that. So that's that. And so obviously it's a question of trade-off between the economy, security, environment. How do you deal with that? So that leads to the question of we must have priorities of where we want to innovate. Innovation is great. If we could do that, we should spend all our money, and I'm very convinced that's the right way to go if we could. But obviously there is a trade-off. So the first question really is, where should we, in what technologies should we invest? And we hear, almost all of us have heard, that there is no silver bullet to the energy or environment problem. We need all sorts of technologies. To me, and I believe that, and to me it means that there's also no silver bullet on innovation. You can't just innovate on solar. You can't just innovate on nuclear. You have to think very strategically. So technological and innovation priorities have to follow from some of the things that we heard from Josh and Bill, which is really where as a country we think we should be in terms of our energy security and in terms of what we think about sustainability and environmental integrity. That's something very obvious, but it also is and should be the driver of what our technological priorities are. I'll give you one example here. Shale gas. We all almost know about, have heard about it, or quite likely are engaged with this resource in one way or the other. It's one resource of what is known as a full group of unconventional hydrocarbon resources. So there's shale gas, there's also shale oil, oil shale, tar sands, methane hydrates, okay? Shale gas has changed the future, the present, and also looking forward, the future of US energy system, at least for the next 2 decades, if not longer. If you look at what we have in terms of resources for oil shale and methane hydrate, that dwarfs what we have for shale gas, okay? But these are technologies that are not there, or certainly not for methane hydrate. There are huge issues. So obviously it behooves on us to think that we need to invest in those technologies, do innovation. At the same time, as we have learned from the shale gas experience, these are also technologies that we are just starting to have some experience with. There are huge environmental concerns and issues which are massive. Water-related issues related to release of methane and so on. So even with something that is just that would be so great to have as reserves or resources to fuel our economy, there are also issues with the same resources. So here we are not even talking about hydrocarbons versus renewables. Here we are talking about even within hydrocarbons. And the same thing applies for wind and solar, for example. For wind, it's good to say let's have 100% wind generation. Well, what does that mean for prices, for investment? It's not easy. We are dealing here in Texas with severe issues of how to integrate, not yet, but it's coming there, how to integrate such large amounts of renewable sources which are intermittent into the grid and maintain reliability and still be safe. So that was my first question: what technologies should we innovating in? The second point is really on competitive advantage, and this it's more directly relevant to international trade and global policy issues. The question is, what is our competitive advantage, and how should we continue to maintain it, improve it? And we heard earlier from Richard that, well, really what our competitive advantage is adding value. That's what it is, right? And again, I can add one more thing to that and say it is also about technology and technological change. That's where the capability to add that value comes from. Now, if you look at the global landscape, there is a lot happening independently of what is happening, all these issues about energy security, environment that we are grappling with here within this country, irrespective and independently of that, a lot is happening in other countries like China, India, Brazil, parts of Europe, in terms of technological change of energy on all sorts of aspects. Now, what does that mean for our competitive advantage? How do we position ourselves to be a player, be a leader, maintain our leadership, and what does that all mean for competitive advantage? Here, the issue really is twofold. First is obviously having the technology and the capability allows us to add value, and that's directly proportional to economic growth. But so do we want to innovate in everything, have the leadership in everything, be the technology provider, supplier to the world supply chain, or the other side of this is, well, there is also a concern, and we need to be mindful that these technologies must also diffuse. Josh earlier mentioned that the problem of climate change. It is mind-boggling, and it's probably the most difficult global problem at the global scale we have faced as a human society, and we need some fast, massive-scale solutions. For that, there are trade-offs here again. One can imagine why one would want to have control over technology, but it's also important to make sure that those technologies diffuse, costs go down, and are widely available. So here again, the point is, well, how should we think about it? How much control, how much innovation, what part of the supply provision should we do versus how should we think about access and cost about these technologies, not just within this country, but more broadly. So the second question really was on competitive advantage, and given what is going on outside of this country, let's say in China, India, parts of Europe, and other countries, where do we stand? How should we reposition ourselves, and where do we go from here? Third, and it's a briefer point that I want to raise here goes back to my third observation, which is look at what we have done in terms of R&D support here in this country in the last 20 years, decreased by an order of magnitude. When our core values is adding value, technological change, technology, and all those, this empirical observation that investments and R&D investments have gone down is just at odds, complete odds with that. How have we come at this position? How have we, why are you investing only $3 billion in energy R&D? How have we landed in this position? And the point really is, what is it with our policy process, with our political system, with our institutions that really have led us to a position which is absolutely contrary to how we think of ourselves, which is really the technology leaders as drivers of economic growth. So the third point really is we ought to be thinking as the fellows what the issues are and how to fix this system, if at all, if we need to debate. But I think there is some serious thinking that needs to be done there. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Excellent, Varun. Thank you so much. All right, and last but not least, we have Associate Professor at the LBJ School, Catherine Weaver. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her research focuses on international organizations, international political economy and development, with a particular focus on the politics and reform of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Her book, The Hypocrisy Trap, The World Bank and the Poverty of Reform, was published by Princeton University Press in November 2008, and she's going to address energy and development. Kate, thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I have the dubious honor of being the fourth professor to speak, so I will try to be blissfully brief, promise you. So I was asked to speak about energy and development, and you'll notice from my bio that energy is conspicuously missing, like in Will's bio. But I know a lot more about development. So I was very happy yesterday when Varun stopped by with a guest, and that guest happened to be the director of the World Bank's Climate Investment Funds. So after about an hour of speaking, I got to ask them the question that was really on my mind. So what am I going to talk about tomorrow in Fort Worth? And he said, energy and development, how much time do you have? I said, 8 minutes. It's like, you need 10 seconds. Because in 10 seconds, you can lay out the two most important statistics that everyone needs to know about energy and development. That is, first, 1.6 billion people in the world live without access to electricity. That's almost 1/4 of the world's population. This number is supposed to reach 2 billion by 2050 because population growth is rapidly outpacing progress in providing electricity access to the poorest regions of the world, which are growing the fastest. Second, 2 to 3 billion people in the developing world lack access to modern energy resources, including oil and gas, and that is hindering their economic progress. Furthermore, we also know that the types of energy resources currently being used in the poorest regions of the world are highly problematic. For example, over 30% of the energy consumed in the developing world comes from biomass fuels, including reliance on just traditional wood. These sources of energy used in everyday life for tasks like cooking are highly inefficient. A kilogram of wood generates only 1/10 of the heat yielded by a kilogram of liquid petroleum gas. There are also negative social and environmental consequences of this reliance on traditional biomass fuels. For example, women and children in poor rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa will spend much of their day collecting firewood for cooking at the expense of attending school and other productive activities. Reliance on biomass also has severe health effects, particularly when used in cook stoves in poorly ventilated areas, which lead to very high rates of respiratory diseases and related deaths, the number one cause of death in many of the poorest regions of the world. So creating access to electricity and to modern energy resources will be absolutely vital to development goals. But it also is going to be very difficult to achieve when infrastructure and governance are very weak in these developing countries. The biggest challenge, of course, will be in the rural areas. More than 2.6 billion people in the world living on less than $2 per day live in rural areas, not urban. And most of them depend on agriculture for their livelihood. Getting out of subsistence agriculture depends on access to modern energy resources for planting and harvesting, for transportation, for refrigeration and storage. Yet getting electricity to these rural areas is extraordinarily difficult, particularly if it's tried to be based on traditional grid electrification. It's not cost effective, these are long distances. And it underscores the dire need for us to look for alternative means of providing electricity for these rural populations through wind power, solar thermal power, small-scale hydropower, and so forth. Currently, only 7% of Africa's potential in hydropower has been tapped. So think about what that would be if we opened up that sector, the creative destruction for Africa. So overall, the consensus among development experts is that access to energy is the ultimate seed capital for development. It's needed to meet the most basic human needs and is the top priority for development. Energy access, in turn, is also needed to conduct business, to attract foreign and direct investment, which is the engine of growth. So it's the first thing that we need to focus on. There are other challenges, of course. We think about the big global picture nowadays and the rise in fuel prices. We have to think about the net importers of those fossil fuels. Energy dependence right now for the poorest countries in the world is one of the biggest reasons why they're sliding back on their progress in the Millennium Development Goals. They simply can't afford to import oil and natural gas because of the spikes in commodity prices. Moreover, for net exporters or producers of fossil fuels in the development world, they face another kind of problem, and that is the deeper problem of the resource curse. Is that paradoxical situation where an abundance of natural resources, particularly in the fossil fuels, hinders development in poor countries by creating conditions ripe for inequality, rent-seeking, corruption, conflict, and the so-called Dutch disease, that thing that overvalues your currencies. And finally, of course, as we read about in most of the readings for today, there's a problem of huge population growth and the global shift in the economic balance of power from the west to the east. And we know that this massive population and economic growth in the developing and the emerging market world will mean a dramatic rise in energy consumption and demand. We've got inadequate energy markets to meet this demand that threaten to dampen economic growth, hobble development, and keep living standards low. So how do we manage to manage the rapid rise in demand for this cheap energy while also working to reduce consumption in global energy that leads to devastating increases in carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions? So that leads me to sort of the last point I want to make, to be brief, and that is, I think that one of our tasks today is to define global responsibilities in addressing the energy needs of the developing world. It's almost like we need to take ourselves out of our very comfortable, broken-in Texas boots and put ourselves in someone else's shoes and walk for a mile to know what it's like to live in a world without energy. So to underscore some of the very passionate things that Josh said about climate change, is that the developing world is much more vulnerable to climate change than we are, even in central Texas where we just got through the hottest summer in history. Africa in particular is considered the most vulnerable continent, even though it only produces 3% of the global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. And to this mind, it raises a lot of interesting questions about the obligations of advanced industrialized countries to do our part in reducing our own emissions through the adoption of clean and renewable energy policies and the constant pursuit of innovation in energy technology. Meanwhile, of course, we have to deal with a very heated debate, no pun intended, but there it is, over whether we should expect or even demand that these developing countries economically develop with stricter standards regarding CO2 emissions. So while the global public good of compelling developing countries to pursue cleaner renewable energy is not in dispute, the fairness of this is. So it's hard to imagine, for example, it's hard for a poor African country with an electrification rate below 10% to be told that it can't use its coal deposits when the current global energy mix comprises of petroleum, coal, and natural gas. That total of fossil fuels account for 85% of energy consumption. And coal alone accounts for 41% of the world's electricity. So who are we to say that if you're a country that's just discovered coal deposits that you can't exploit that? We have to think about the fairness question there. Simply put, it is becoming increasingly clear from watching successive climate change talks that developing countries are not going to accept a system in which the highly industrialized countries require lower income countries to adopt energy policies that we ourselves are not willing to embrace. So we need to think about our responsibilities. And so we end up with this conundrum or puzzle that must be addressed when we think about energy and development. If energy consumption is the main cause of climate change, but it also is the main promise for achieving progress in development and lifting people out of poverty, how do we square that circle? So the big takeaway point here is that the developing and the emerging market world needs access to, and will increasingly demand as their growth rates exceed 8-10%, the modern energy resources at affordable prices. But in the global context of concerns over commodity prices and climate change, this energy will have to draw increasingly from clean and renewable resources that are low carbon emitting and sustainable. So how can we create synergy between the seeming trade-off between sustainable development and clean energy and rapid growth? So in a sense, that's our task, is that we have to try to figure out the win-win scenario that achieves both these goals. And also, I believe this requires that we assume our own responsibilities towards that end.
Thank you so much, Kate. That's fantastic. Great. Great. Okay, everybody, I think I'm going to exercise the privilege of the chair here since we're running a little bit late and actually go ahead and move you to your rooms. It seems pretty clear that solving even one set of questions as presented here is incredibly daunting, never mind all four and all the ones that we didn't mention. So please have it completed by the end of the day. And thank you so much. And please proceed to your rooms that are on your name tags. There's coffee and refreshments outside the doors. And we'll next see you for a group photo at 12:15.